When George H. Brimhall became BYU's third president in 1904, the survival of the school was in jeopardy. To be saved, it needed to be upgraded academically. The church's resources were severely strained, and it could only support the most indispensable of its educational programs. Within a few years, President Brimhall was able to hire 4 impressive young faculty members with advanced degrees from prestigious Eastern universities. In the small frontier school of about 100 collegiate students, these teachers' knowledge of the latest intellectual currents of the day and their passion for learning had an electrifying impact.
After having a chance to study this and read a little bit more about this story, it's really clear that Brimhall hired these professors because he thought it was the best thing for the university. He thought they would help the university grow academically if we had talented and eager professors from the East.
I get the same sense as I've read about Brimhall that this is exactly what he wanted. These professors had an ability to inspire and to teach the students and help them to want to learn academically.
And particularly, he was pleased with the fact that these were faithful Latter-day Saint men, and he wanted them to bring their faith and their knowledge to BYU and teach students in this new free-thinking philosophy. But reports began circulating that students were losing their faith, and parents and church leaders around the territories became concerned about their youth who were falling away from the church.
One of these concerned students wrote to Brimhall, and it's a sad letter. He says that the struggle between science and religion is severe, and the former is fast destroying the simple faith so necessary it seems for happiness. At least in my own mind, since my last years at school, there has arisen many questions that I am unable to solve, and I know what it means to be at sea.
Students like this one, it seems, were for the first time faced with a crisis between the skepticism that was nationwide in college campuses and the faith that they'd been taught by their families.
This was in the fall of 1910. Always a kindly diplomat, President Brimhall asked the concerned parents and church leaders to be patient. He would work with the teachers in question. He also proposed to Church President Joseph F. Smith that the matter be handled quietly on campus. But when he approached the teachers to suggest that they proceed more carefully, at least 3 of them said that it wasn't Brimhall's place to tell them how to teach their subjects.
It's not surprising to me that the church assigned the superintendent of schools, Horace Cummings, to come down and to try and find out what was going on. He spent 9 days talking to faculty and to students, trying to get to the real story.
One thing that really surprised me as I was reading through his report is this has always been presented as a crisis over evolution at BYU, when in fact evolution wasn't the problem at all. The problem was that these teachers were teaching speculations on religion in their theology classes, and that was drawing students away from their faith.
After looking at Cummings' autobiography and reading some of the points and the things that were being taught in these theology classes, it strikes me that this would have been really difficult to deal with as a student. One of the points was that the Bible is treated as a collection of myths. Another is that, let's see, here it is. It says visions and revelations are mental suggestions, and that religion, like science, must be expressed in terms of knowledge, and that faith is regarded with pity as superstition and is not characteristic of the intellectually trained. That would have been a great challenge to me as a student, especially having men of this caliber and from these great universities saying these things.
I've tried to think about what it would be like for President Brimhall. It was difficult for him as well. I think that he was torn between his desires to see this university grow through the academic training these professors had, but also for his desires to see his students grow in their faith and their understanding of the gospel.
I think the seriousness of the situation really dawned on Brimhall as he visited with the students. Horace Cummings writes in his autobiography that one day Brimhall asked a group of students if they'd been saying their prayers, and they said no. because they'd been taught in school that there was no real God to hear them.
Superintendent Cummings recorded that after this incident, President Brimhall had a dream. In the dream, Brimhall saw several of the BYU professors standing around a peculiar machine on the campus. When one of them touched a spring, a baited fishhook attached to a long, thin wire rose rapidly into the air. Casting his eyes around the sky, he discovered a flock of snow-white birds circling among the clouds, seemingly very happy. When one of them, seeing the bait on the hook, darted toward it and grabbed it, one of the professors touched a spring in the machine, and the bird was rapidly hauled down to the earth. Brimhall next discovered that the birds who had been caught were actually students, dressed in Greek costumes, looking very discouraged and downcast. "What makes you so sad and downhearted?" Brimhall asked them. "Alas," they responded, "we can never fly again."
Superintendent Cummings felt that it was this dream, as well as the visit that Brimhall had with the students, that convinced him that a change needed to be made, that his long-held desire for diplomacy and persuasion simply wasn't working, and that a line had to be drawn.
Brimhall writes to his friend Reed Smoot at the same time, "I was lenient and patiently hopeful that men would change gradually as they have in other cases, but the storm, instead of dying out, increased in its fury."
They were interviewed by 5 apostles who invited them to change the way that they were teaching, to be a little more sensitive to their students. And these professors refused to change.
The Board of Trustees told the professors that they had 2 choices. They could be a bit more careful in regards to their students, or they could resign. And the men chose to resign.
The decision to ask for the resignations of 3 of the teachers caused an uproar on the campus and in the community. According to a petition printed in the Provo Daily Herald, over 90% of the college students opposed it. Brimhall was called an anti-intellectual and an enemy of academic freedom. People jumped to the erroneous conclusion that the teachers were dismissed because they were teaching evolution. Some of the most prominent of the faculty members said Brimhall had ruined the university and predicted that it would never recover.
The Mazer building was just being completed, a building that the students and faculty had sacrificed so much for. And Brimhall wrote to his friend, Reed Smoot. He said, "I would rather the Mazer Memorial remain a sealed tomb containing our college hopes and ambitions than to have its doors thrown open to influences antagonistic to the heroism, inspiration, and revelation of those who have made the school."
As I read the board minutes and the Cummings report, I get the sense that the concern of the general authorities was that perhaps these teachers were abusing their authority by trying to persuade the students to believe that these ideas were absolute truths when they weren't established by science or scholarship.
And you know, that wouldn't be honest in any setting, but especially at 1910 BYU, where the students were so fresh off the farm and so eager to accept the teachings of their professors. These professors were so anxious to convince their students that the simple faith they'd been taught by their parents was foolishness, and that they ought to believe the ways of learning that these men had learned in graduate school.
In my mind, Brimhall's decision was selfless, but it was also unpopular. But he made the decision that he thought was best for the students.
I think President Brimhall understood that secular learning and spiritual learning can't be separated, but that they must be viewed as one whole. And to take one of those away is to undercut the ability of the students to really pursue truth.
As I think about this, it seems to me that President Brimhall was actually preserving the academic freedom of his students by allowing them to be able to explore the truths of religion and academics and decide for themselves how to blend these truths in their lives.
In spite of the criticism Brimhall endured, he never wavered from his decision. Judging by the sermonettes he subsequently presented at the weekly school assemblies, this experience changed him. He spoke often and eloquently of the importance of the school faithfully following the guidance of the church leaders. Brimhall had become convinced that those leaders were the stewards of BYU's charted mission to gather all truth into one harmonious whole. They had guided President Brimhall through the crisis that had threatened this mission, and he was sure that they alone could keep it on its course.